Welcome to Keep Calm Crisis Talks with Clarity Global. I'm Robyn Sefiani, President ANZ and Reputation Counsel at Sefiani, part of Clarity Global. We're a strategic communications, reputation management and digital marketing agency. In each episode, we connect with a crisis and reputation management specialist to delve into their learnings and share that. Today, my guest is Bob McNaney, a US-based member of our Clarity Global Crisis Council. Bob is a strategic communications and crisis management expert who supports organisations through crisis situations from beginning to end. He covers crisis preparedness, crisis and issues response, media coaching, executive counselling and reputation management. He serves as a trusted advisor to CEOs, boards, and executive leadership teams before, during, and after crisis situations. Prior to forming the McNaney Group, Bob was SVP at Padilla, providing counsel to clients around the world. Prior to that, and this is where I'm really interested to know more, Bob, you're an Emmy award-winning investigative journalist for 24 years, covering national and international reporting. So in our discussion today, I'd love to delve into that experience and how that informs managing media in a crisis. Welcome, Bob.
Well, thank you, Robyn. I'm very excited to share some of the learnings of the many years in and around the media in various capacities. And it's an exceptional opportunity to speak with you on this because this is a big part of what we do, isn't it, each day? Trying to help our clients understand the media setting, no matter where they are in the world, and come up with a strategic game plan so that they can take a bad situation and don't make it worse.
Exactly. So, Bob, can we start by delving a little into your journalism career? I'd be fascinated to hear some of the high stakes situations that you reported on, and then we can perhaps draw from that any learnings that you then apply to advising clients in a crisis.
Well, I was very, very fortunate. I was able to work as a journalist here in the United States, covering events across the country and internationally as well for more than 20 years. And I was raised in the generation in the journalism school where we understood that it was is a very important role. You are literally a scribe to history, and we were taught to be neutral. And so I was very, very fortunate to have access to so many events across the globe. Some were very difficult to witness. I always told my friends and family I was the buffer. I saw things that I don't ever want you to see. But I also got the front row seats to spectacular moments. And those are fun, whether it was an international sporting event where there was great joy, or it might be in a war zone or a riot or a hurricane where there's great human tragedy. It didn't really matter because as a journalist, I was able to see and experience so many things that others just don't get to see and experience. And as part of the kind of crossover to my current day, people have asked me, how do you make that crossover? How does that brain work? And I think it's simply the ability to find complex, sometimes chaotic, and turn it into a simple story. Whether, again, you fly into a devastated area, whether you're in a scene of chaos, a scene of exhilaration after a football match, it really doesn't matter because you have to grab it, understand it, and then share the story in a meaningful way. And that's what our clients do all the time. And as a counselor, I help them do that, kind of boil the ocean sometimes.
So, Bob, having spoken to you recently, we were talking about your experience in Bosnia, 9/11, the Hong Kong handover to China from the British. Mm-hmm. When you're in situations where perhaps your own security is at risk, how do you keep safe? And I'm intrigued by that because of, we've got current conflict in the Ukraine, in the Middle East. Journalists are reporting from the heart of that conflict. How do journalists keep safe?
Well, it's a very dangerous world. It truly is, and we see it. My hat is off to all those journalists that are covering the very dangerous situations, especially in the Middle East right now. It is very, very dangerous. And I was blessed to get through it. Part of it is awareness of your surroundings. Part of it is teamwork, watching out for one another, having each other's back, literally and figuratively. A little bit of experience. Sometimes you have to know when to put the camera down, the pad down, and get safe. Okay, because it's
Yeah.
just you have to understand these things. But I think one of the keys, Robyn, is preparation. Preparation. What are we getting into? And there is the old adage that no plan ever survived contact with the enemy, right? It's an old military phrase. But the reality is, if you prepare, so you know where you're going, you know who your contacts are, you know what you should be watching out for, you know who's helping you, and you know when to quit. Going in, when the dynamics change, you can make faster and more reasonable decisions. And again, I liken that to what we do with clients in a crisis situation. The more prepared you are for
Yes.
something awful to happen, the better off you can manage it. But make no mistake, there have been probably times in my career as a journalist that I was just plain lucky. We were shot at. We were in very dangerous weather circumstances. It's not fun and it's not easy. I personally lost a very close friend to a helicopter crash covering the news. And those are the moments where you realize you may not even be in a compromised situation, but the physical gathering of news can be very challenging. You think of where journalists go to get their news, where they go to get their stories, how they get them. They're in harm's way as they're telling people to stay out of harm's way.
Yes, that's right. So, Bob, the adrenaline must have been pumping in that type of
Mhm.
situation. Why did you switch from journalism to being a corporate communications counsellor?
I don't know. That is the honest question at first. It was an interesting journey. I was first approached by the chairman of a previous firm, and we chatted about it. And she knew me through my journalism and thought my brain might be wired the right way. And we talked, and we decided it just wasn't the right time. So about 8 years later, she came back, and we had the same conversations. And I remember her saying to me at the final step before I accepted my role, she says, "I'm going to spend the next 2 hours telling you why you shouldn't do this." And I said, "No, you're not." But I think what it came down to was it was the confluence of events. I had done a lot of things in my career, and I was very, very proud of those moments. But I was always true. I thought I was trying to always be true to that neutrality. Tell the story and let others decide. I was looking for a time in my life, in my career, where I could use all the talents that I had and advocate. So one of the big draws was I could now advocate for organizations, large companies, small companies, and I could use all of the learnings from the journalism world and my real life experiences and help folks. And whether it's the
Yeah.
crisis response, the crisis planning, the media coaching, the speaker coaching I do, it was an opportunity to go from objective to someone who can counsel.
That's great. And then applying all of those learnings, now that you are advising CEOs and leadership teams in difficult situations, what do you see as a natural human response when a crisis occurs, and how do you keep your clients calm and advise them on the best approach? Do they talk to a journalist straight away, or do they look at a different channel? How do you balance all of that, Bob?
Yeah. First of all, relax, slow down. The
Keep
journalist time,
calm.
yeah, keep calm, as we say. Part of it is understanding that you have more control than you think you have in most situations. Now, there are what I will call evolving crisis, and that's usually what we see, as you know, in the corporate world. It's an issue that's moving along. There are those boom or exploding crises. It's a little different. You have to act very quickly. But I start with a couple of things. I set the tone. I said, wait a minute. Is this hurt or is this harm? And hurt and harm are very, very different things. So before we even decide it's a crisis, we have to decide what's what. Hurt is social media. Hurt is your brand is in a negative light in the media. Harm is your biggest customers are stopping orders. Consumers are boycotting or protesting. Your staff is leaving. An issue is hurt. A crisis is harm. So the first thing we got to do, because every client, as you knew, calls us and says, we have a crisis. No, you don't. Most of the time, you have an issue. So number one, help them understand. Number two, I usually say to the group, and I say this when I speak to executives in public speaking opportunities. I ask people to raise their hand if they're perfect. Okay, so raise your hand if you're perfect. And we're not perfect. We're a good friend of mine who's a Catholic priest says, Bobby, we are held together in life by duct tape and holy water. That's it. Okay. We're imperfect, right? We're imperfect human beings. We're imperfect companies. So as you go into this crisis, realize the expectation of resolving or communicating or protecting your brand is not perfection. It is reasonability. What is a reasonable response to coming from a responsible organization? So we get them off the ledge of we have to fix it perfectly, okay? And that I think that's really, really important. The other thing I try to get them to understand is inside out. So the concentric circle, inside out. One of the hardest things I've been told and I've witnessed from people who go from the media to roles such as ours, they get too focused on the media. They think it's the number one audience. They think it's the number one concern because often the it or the problem is going to be exposed. The reality is the media is often not your biggest worry. Most of the time it's not. So I asked the internal team to think internally. Let's think out what we got. Let's communicate to our own people, our staff, our team. Let's reach out then to our key stakeholders. So work it out, inside out. When organizations worry about the outside in, they double and triple their problems because I like to call it family business. If we tell our family what's going on, our employees, our key stakeholders, they're not going to leak it. They're not going to talk about it because they feel like they're informed. If we start with the outside and they all of a sudden feel like we're telling the world something we're not telling them, that's where your internal leaks come from. So one of the biggest things I then tell them is inside out.
So it's like that concentric circle model, isn't it? And thinking about who the key stakeholders are. Are they regulators? Are they investors? Are they employees? I think that's a really nice visual image, Bob, for us all to remember. And really pause and think, okay, who needs to know what and when?
Exactly.
That's pretty much it, isn't it?
It is. And I'm a big believer in walking toward the crisis. Accept it. Walk toward it. The world's going to find out eventually. And so you take that and you start communicating. One of my favorite phrases to share with companies is that the lack of communication creates distance, and distance creates distrust. So the lack of communication creates distance, and distance creates distrust. You may not have a lot of information you can share, but if you share it and then give another bite size, you start that cadence of piecemeal information, you're going to be building equity with your stakeholders.
So talking about information, let's look at disinformation and misinformation, which is just proliferating now in so many areas of our society and politics. As an ex-journalist, how do you advise clients if you're helping them through a crisis situation and disinformation and misinformation is proliferating on social media? How do you then engage journalists to perhaps try and give a balanced story, or do you would you video a CEO, for example, and place that video on X or on LinkedIn? Can you just give us a little bit of insight into how you would manage that situation when you're fighting disinformation?
Yes, because one of the things we constantly struggle with is disappointing our clients, correct? And disappointing our stakeholders.
Yes,
The
yes.
only two ways that you disappoint people generally is if you don't set expectations or you set unrealistic expectations. So in this scenario, I'm frank with executives. The media in most parts of the world is no longer the referee, the official with the neutrality. It's agenda driven journalism. End of story, especially here in the United States. It's a joke. It's this agenda or this agenda, and there's very little in between. So I tell them
Right.
that so that they understand that they may not get necessarily the fair shake that they'd like. That's fine. It doesn't matter. You know, there are times when you talk to a journalist who you don't agree with, who's going to be difficult on you for a couple of reasons. You still want to hit their audience. So if we're going to communicate with a news outlet that may not be giving us favorable coverage, I remind folks that we're not talking to the reporter, we're talking through the reporter. So
Yeah.
through the reporter to the audience, if you can captivate a few people in the audience, that's helpful. I try when I can to then if we know we're really going to get it, we'll strategize. We'll try to reach out to the reporter and say, look, where are you going with this as a journalist? A lot of times, if it's not on a tight deadline, we know that's a good thing. We also know it means that they're going to spend more time on it moving forward. So that's where usually I counsel the communications folks to reach out to the reporter through email, try to ferret out, draw out information, questions that will help us directionally. If we, what kind of questions do you have? What time frame? What subject matter? Who have you talked to? Some basic things like that allows us to essentially try to figure out where they're going with things, and that helps us anticipate the questions they're going to have, and it also helps us make a decision: do we want to put someone in front of her, in an interview setting or not? There are ways. Yes, one of the challenges is before you put an executive on social media on a crisis, you want to make sure that that crisis is getting traction or is going to get traction. Because the last thing I want to do is have one media outlet do a nondescript story, and next thing I know, I got my CEO on X and or LinkedIn, and
You're
that's not a good
creating the crisis. You're
you're
adding
creating
fuel
it.
to the yes, of
Exactly.
course.
Exactly.
Yes.
But once we know that it's out there and it's real, I do like the idea of working with the reporter to see what's what. Often we will find a quote unquote reasonable or friendly journalist. We'll give them some sort of access so they hear it from here first, and then we'll use the social channels to back it up. I hope that made sense to folks.
Yes. And if you have a client that um, gets drawn into an investigation by a journalist, so that journalist is going to be coming to you or your client to say, okay, I've got some questions. I've been investigating this matter. It
Mm-hmm.
might be involving your client, or it might be involving an industry sector for, say, bad behaviour.
Mm-hmm.
Um, what do you advise your client? Do you advise your client to participate in the interview, because this is you on the other side of the table? You
Mm-hmm.
were an investigative journalist, right? And
Yeah.
so when you went to interview a politician or a CEO about a matter that you were delving into, I would presume you had done a huge amount of homework. You talked to a whole lot of people, potentially even a whistleblower,
Mm-hmm.
and therefore can you just talk us through that process of what you already know as a journalist, and then what you're seeking to have verified, and then the judgment call you would make now as a crisis counsellor to say to your client, yes, you need to participate in this interview, or no, you're not going to win here. Let's just do it. Let's find out the questions and do a
Mm-hmm.
written statement. I'd love your thoughts on that, Bob.
Yeah, so I'll go back to my old self, right? The investigative journalist. I would tell people that the only time that an investigative journalist calls you is to invite you to your own funeral. Okay. It's
Right.
done. I've got it all. I've got the whistleblower, I've got the videotape, I've got the surveillance, I've got the reports, I've got it all. And I'm just coming to check that last box and say, what say you? Okay. And so it's a really precarious situation to be in. So, one of the tactics that we use now, that I use with clients, especially in complicated industries, and whether it's pharma or it can either construction, it can be anything that's got nuances to it. One of the things you can do is if you really are strongly considering doing an interview, before you do that, see if you can get the journalist to come in with someone else, maybe a subject matter expert, the communications folks, and do an education hour. Okay. We know this is totally on background. We want to help. We want to make sure we understand your story, but we also want you to understand what the real world in this world looks like. So, will you give us an hour? Okay. You can write whatever you want, not about that meeting. You can publish anything you want down the road. But if you don't know how the industry really works, we're all going to have issues. So try that. Let's walk you through the why. Let's assume you're right, but I'll tell you why you're not kind of moment. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. It doesn't stop the story, but sometimes it takes a little bit of the sharpness off the sabers. So if you can get them in to help that education, great. And then whether or not you want to put your CEO, it is rare that I put a CEO in front of a reporter. I view them as the top, and I save that for loss of human life. I use that for absolute top
Yes.
reputational
Yes.
things. I'd rather have a
Yeah.
subject matter expert explain why. But if I am going to do it, it really then comes down to this: is this the thing? Is this something that can harm us in a big way? Is this, more importantly, an opportunity to speak to regulators, for example, or speak to our big customers? So that, again, that idea is, I'm not so worried about the interview going bad. There are plenty of interviews that go poorly and they look nervous, blah, blah, blah. I can live with that. What I can't live with is, after the story, if we come across as looking cold hearted and stonewalling, do regulators pick up on that? Do I have in this country now members of Congress holding hearings with my client or my client industry? And I can tell you that is no fun. We don't want to wake a regulatory sleeping bear. And so sometimes you have to bring your people out so that you show that opportunity, willingness to communicate, and it does soften it just a bit. Again, I generally don't put people in front of a camera unless it's so egregious that we just have to come out there and say, we messed up, we were wrong, it's on me, we're going to fix it. And if you do things like that, you come off looking really, really strong.
Yes, it's that demonstration of genuine authenticity, of empathy, and a commitment to ensure it doesn't happen again.
Mhm.
Um, so, Bob, the situations that we're talking about are very stressful for the companies and the leaders involved. Can you share with us perhaps an example of an organisation that you've worked with where the CEO has had to endure, maybe not just one crisis, but a crisis can evolve and escalate. And I'm interested to explore how you work with a CEO through that situation to keep them calm and keep them resilient when all odds are against them.
Yes, it's no fun. It is no fun. And part of being a CEO is being a very lonely person in many respects, because you don't have colleagues. You're at the tip of the triangle, tip of the pyramid. And so that's the opportunity for us to come in as advisors to say, look, I'm going to look at this thing holistically. We're going to fix the organization, but you're not going to have a heart attack on my watch. You're not going to get upset with your family on my watch. You're not going to shirk responsibility in other places in your life. So you have to kind of work with them to have them understand that the only way they're going to get through the kind of pressure and stress that they're under is to take care of themselves. Talk to your family. Take 15 minutes to step outside. Relegate and delegate. Trust your team. But it's difficult. It is really, really difficult. I think the key is understanding that everybody has issues, and you learn from them. So that the example that you and I chatted with recently was a large hospital system, and what I'm going to walk you through would be a horrible career, let alone 16 months. Okay, all of this happened. It was the largest nursing strike in the history of the United States. Largest, most expensive. Get that wrapped up and COVID hits. We all across the world know the difficulties with COVID, especially in the healthcare world. And as COVID is winding down, the hospital where the main hospital in the system was just a few blocks away from the George Floyd situation, which led to very, very serious and dangerous rioting here in the Twin Cities and across the country, but fires and neighborhoods destroyed, just lawlessness for days on end. And the hospital was right in the middle of that. So patients were afraid to come, staff was afraid to come. So now you got a security issue. They get through that, and unfortunately, the CEO's college-age daughter passed away very suddenly at school. And while she's on bereavement, a patient comes into one of their small town clinics and kills a nurse and injures others because he was upset that his medications had been taken away. And so now you have concerns again about the physical security of the hospital system. That is a heck of a thing to go through. Now, to her credit, the CEO came off bereavement leave to go comfort her team all throughout the system. And the takeaway from that, the thing that was admirable, most admirable in many respects, is the organization learned and listened to themselves. During the nurses' strike, how did they communicate effectively? What channels did they use? What was the cadence like? Did they kind of over communicate? Yes, I think they did at times, but that was their culture. That was what's expected. So then during COVID, they used the same medley, and then back, and then back, and then back, and then back. So they didn't reinvent the wheel. And they had a crisis plan that I built for them. And they practiced their spokespeople. I distinctly remember the day of the shooting. It was in rural Minnesota. I was in Manhattan. I was just about to walk into what was supposed to be a very long meeting, and my contact called and told me what was going on. He said, "No problem, we're going to get through it, blah, 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 blah." And about an hour later, they got the doctor on the phone who was going to deliver the first press conference. And he had already been trained. He knew who I was. We had practiced many times on many occasions. So I'm walking down the street to get a car to get to the airport, to get back to Minneapolis. He's walking to a car to get to the hospital. And we were able to media train refresh over the phone. And those situations only happen as if you take the preparation seriously. You trust the policies, procedures that you put in place. And that was an opportunity for this particular CEO and her senior staff to lead. Here's what's expected. Let's do it again. Let's do it again. And let's do it again. And a lot of organizations are afraid of crisis. They have it and they want to forget it, never talk about it, never examine how they did. And to their credit, this worked out really well. Kind of a long-winded story, but it was an incredible many, many months.
And Bob, were you the sort of trusted external advisor through that 16 months? You were there providing reassurance, providing counsel, and I guess also helping keep people calm, right?
You tried to. I try to bring a little bit of humor to things. and perspective. It's sometimes more difficult, but in a sense. So let me just back up to that story I just told you. Imagine it's a Friday night. You get the call, and you have this terrible thing happening with a member of their family. Well, the CEO entrusted myself and one of the internal team to decide, what are we going to do? We knew the media already knew what was coming, and they were going to put a photo out or do whatever they're going to do. So in that case, the CEO trusted us to say, what's the strategy? And we said, let's go proactive. Get your favorite picture of your daughter. We'll contact the university. We'll deal with it. Let's just proactively do this, because they're going to know it's going to come out. Here's what it is. Here's what it isn't. Go. And we're talking about someone who then was really literally putting the reputation of her own family and her own daughter in her team's hands externally. I think that's an example of trust.
Yes, it is. And I think there's a saying, isn't there, that I think you've shared with me. Is it to trust your, what's that? Trusting your advisor.
You have to trust. Yeah, you have to know your trusted advisor before you can trust your trusted advisor.
That's it. And therefore, the crisis preparedness and building that relationship and getting to know each other, the external advisor and the CEO and his or her leadership team, and working through the crisis simulations, the media coaching, and getting to know and understand each other. And I think also for us as external advisors, understanding the boundaries of how far we can go, because ultimately we can give the very best advice, but at the end of the day, it's the client who decides whether they will accept the advice fully or partially. So Bob, we're getting toward the end of our wonderful conversation. As far as maybe some key takeaways, some insights on dealing with media in a crisis, or deciding whether or not to reach out to journalists, or whether or not to accept an invitation for interview, would there be 3 or 4 key insights that you could share with our listeners about effective media management in a crisis?
I think it starts with slowing down, understanding that you can get a reporter to wait on a story if the reporter understands they're going to get good information. Slow down. Just because it's a 4 p.m. deadline doesn't necessarily mean you need to rush and get a bad response out. You can always update the story. Yes, we want the first story to be as positive as it can be, but I'd rather get the second or third story right than rush my way through. So number 1, make sure you don't rush. Number 2, think about how that story is going to play. Again, it's not the reporter or the media that's going to hurt you or harm you. It's the more important stakeholders. Are you doing this story so that you can reach your key stakeholders, your customers, your healthcare patients, your regulators? So considering, is this a good way to reach them? Or are you better off just to reach out to them in advance and say, we got a problem, and you're going to hear about it? That's usually what takes place. Be prepared. People, as you talked about, crisis plans, but you need people who are good communicators. Sometimes people will say to me, I don't need media training for my executives because they don't go on TV much, or I don't need coaching because we don't speak to the public very much. Well, you know what? Get them trained anyway, because they go to meetings 20 times a day. And if they're good communicators in a meeting in front of the board or anyone else in a stressful situation, they're going to be just fine in front of a reporter. So get your people trained up front. And then lastly, I go back to an earlier point. Always, always, always start with your people. How does this crisis impact human lives? I don't care if you're a financial firm and there's a data breach, or you're a food company and there's an illness or death. Your messaging has to be human, end user human. Those would be my top 3 or 4 to get started.
That's so wise, and obviously drawn from many years of experience on both sides of the desk as an investigative journalist and now a leading crisis counsellor. Bob, it's been an absolute pleasure. So we've run out of time, but to quickly summarise, I just want to remind our listeners that the Clarity Global Crisis Council is here to help address any crisis or reputation risk whenever and wherever it occurs around the world. Our Follow the Sun service includes crafting crisis response management plans, and we've talked about that today, designing crisis preparedness workshops and simulations, auditing digital footprints for reputation risk, tackling social media disinformation, preparing for forthcoming legal action, building resilience across digital and media platforms, managing a live crisis, and curating a bespoke approach to reputation challenges on the horizon. Please join me next time when I'll be speaking to another fascinating guest about crisis and reputation management. Until then, keep well and keep calm. I'm Robyn Sefiani. Bye for now.